Welcome back. In this training video, we'll learn how to create, edit, and send a purchase order to a supplier right from FOURA. A purchase order is much more than a reference document that helps determine what's been ordered, received, and still due in. In FOURA, a purchase order is an essential business tool that can improve business processes and performance in several areas. Let's think about some of the benefits using a purchase order. Purchase orders ensure clear communications to suppliers. It documents mutually acceptable payment terms and offers legal protections. They help receiving personnel quickly identify items, quantities ordered, and delivery inconsistencies in real time. And they help accounts payable identify any pricing discrepancies on supplier invoices later on. When used for planning purposes, purchase orders can reduce the amount of coordination overall for a business and reduce the purchases done in the field. This provides the business efficiencies and a more accurate view of actual costs, which can help the business become more profitable. Over time, the purchase orders can help identify trends, provide insights to the business's actual purchasing power, and help assess supplier performance, which can lead to negotiating better pricing and payment terms, which could improve business cash flow by aligning costs and revenues. So as you can see, the purchase order is a fundamental tool for improving business processes to gain greater efficiency and profitability. So let's get started. Like many of the workflows in FOURA, the purchase order follows the basic document status workflow seen here. Let's take a look at it so we can have a point of reference for any comments made about document status later in the tutorial. Starting in the upper left, when a new document is first created, it immediately transitions to draft status. A document in draft status can either be deleted, validated, or released. Validated simply refers to a systemic pre-check to make sure the minimum entry requirements have been met. Released documents are actionable, meaning they've met the minimum criteria for the purchase order and can be issued to the supplier and used for receiving purposes. Some businesses will close release documents after a period of time while others do not. An example of this would be to close release purchase orders that were older than 36 months to limit the number of active documents and information that shows up in buyer queries. Unless your business is creating massive purchase order volumes, buyers probably won't need to worry about closing status. Release documents can also be revised and re-released. While documents are being revised, they cannot be used downstream, so it's important that revisions are done swiftly. And finally, released and revised documents can be canceled if no downstream activities have occurred. If a purchase order was partially received, the balance due in could be canceled or quantity zeroed out, but the purchase order could not be canceled because of active receipts and active payments would be affiliated with that document. However, if a purchase order had not been received against, the purchase order could be canceled and no receipts or payments could be issued against that specific purchase order. Okay, let's move on to the purchase order process. To create a purchase order, the user needs the buyer security role. The purchase order form can be found in the purchasing main menu, then select the purchasing submenu, which displays the purchase order menu option in the functional menu. The form can also be accessed by typing POS in the menu code area of the FOURA Navigator. Like many forms in FOURA, the purchase order has a header section with the main menu, a quick filter, and some action buttons. Then there's the body of the form, and a footer section at the bottom. A buyer would generally open this form with the intent of either accessing an existing purchase order or to create a new purchase order. If there were any purchase orders in draft status, then these would be visible upon opening the form. So we know right away this buyer for our fictitious Office Station database has no purchase orders that are waiting to be finalized and released. So let's look at how we can access existing purchase orders first. The quick filter has several predefined filters that allow the buyer to easily access records by buyer, status, or time periods. The all icon next to the down arrow can be selected, which resets any quick filter selections and provides view access to all purchase orders. Upon selecting the all filter, we see in our footer that there are more than 100 purchase orders in our fictitious Office Station database. To the right of the quick filter, there are several control buttons. Let's take a few minutes to look over the other components of the form. In the body of the form there are some controls, 4 tabs, and a notes area at the bottom. In the body is where we can also see the status of the purchase order. This one happens to be closed. The footer is at the bottom of the form that provides navigational and search controls and a status display area for activity on the form. At the top of the body is control details that display the purchase order and revision numbers for that purchase order. To the right is the order date, buyer initials, the company, and the warehouse where the goods will be managed from. The header tab is the default tab that displays general information for the purchase order. The supplier is listed with the supplier contacts and payment terms. To the right of the supplier information is the ship to details with an attention to field. Below that is the shipping details, currency controls, and drop ship, supplier confirmation, and supplier acknowledgement checkboxes. Then there are two tabs where the buyer can document any shipping instructions or general comments that need to be printed on the purchase order. And just under that shows the dates and times of when the purchase order was printed or changed, as well as the number of lines and the total value of the purchase order. The validation field will display a red X if an error has occurred during the validation process. More on that in a moment. The Lines tab is where the buyer can enter the line item detail for each order. This is a grid display with dedicated menu controls. And because it's a grid, the buyer can determine what columns to display by using the column chooser. To learn more about the column chooser, please select the F1 button and visit the subject in FOURA's help files. The Details tab is a page view, which displays the line detail from the previous Lines tab in an easy-to-read page format. This Details tab displays additional information such as quantity conversions like the lowest unit of measurement or LUM. The Do text can display simple information like as available, to clearly indicate that the buyer doesn't need the supplier to collect the full quantity before they ship. Then there are due dates, unit cost, and a special discount checkbox that will omit the line from being part of a standard cost calculation. The requester and deliver to can also be specified here, as well as the commodity codes, accounting details, and authorization and purchase request information. The record counter at the bottom allows the buyer to advance through the lines as necessary. The Notes tab is where the buyer can enter non-printed notes that helps the buyer facilitate the request, the purchase, and the delivery of the goods or services. Now that we've had a quick look at the completed purchase order, let's go ahead and create a new one of our own. There are two ways to create a purchase order. The buyer can make a copy of an existing purchase order and then modify as needed, or start from a blank purchase order form. To make a copy of the current purchase order, the buyer needs to select the Copy Plus button in the header. This opens the Add Purchase Order form and automatically assigns the next sequential purchase order number in the buyer's assigned range. The buyer simply needs to validate this information and select the Add button. The purchase order form opens in draft status and is a near exact copy of the original purchase order. We say near because the order date is now set to the current date, and the due date on the order lines is 2 weeks out from the current date, which is the default. Now the buyer simply makes any modifications necessary to the line detail and the purchase order is ready to be released. Now that you see how easy it is to leverage the existing purchase order, let's create a new purchase order using the blank purchase order form. To do this, select the plus button from either the main menu or in the header section. Both open the Add Purchase Order form and automatically assigns the next sequential purchase order number to the buyer's assigned range. Then we simply verify the company code and the buyer name and select the Add button. Now we're at the blank purchase order form. We'll leave the order date set to today and the warehouse set to the default warehouse location. This is also the default location for purchase order lines. The first thing we want to do is select the supplier by selecting the Find icon, which opens up the Find Suppliers form that lists all the active suppliers. We can find the supplier by simply scrolling, or we can enter a filter in the filter bar. Alternatively, on the purchase order form, we could also enter ST into the Ordered From field, and then select the Find icon again to view the same result. Now we can select the OK button since the stylus manufacturing is what we're looking for. The default supplier information imports from the supplier record. This includes information such as their address, payment, Incoterms, currency, and shipping method. The shipping instructions come from the PO ship text that is part of the buyer's profile. Please see the Buyer Setup tutorial for more information on that topic. Keep in mind that these are simply defaults, and all of these values can be modified independently as needed. It's easy to get right back to the supplier record and adjust any information if necessary. Simply select the Zoom link next to the supplier code to view the supplier record. It's good practice to document the name of the individual who you were dealing with at the supplier. This helps with accountability and communication should anything need to be discussed later on. The buyer can add a contact by entering basic information in the Add Contact form. In the interest of time, we'll select an existing inside sales contact. Now we should select where we want the materials to be shipped. During the initial office station setup in FOURA, we created two internal company addresses, which are readily available by selecting either of the buttons just above the Ship To address. And as you can see, we've set up one for the office station warehouse and one for the office station headquarters or HQ. Selecting either of these buttons will load the appropriate Ship To address information into the form. However, we're not limited to ship only to these two locations. We can select any address that has already been entered into FOURA, or we can add a new address by selecting the Add New button. To keep things simple for this tutorial, we'll just select the Warehouse button. The available selection and the Attention To dropdown are affiliated with the specific address code. Below the Attention To are some informational checkboxes that allow us to manually status communications with the supplier over the purchase order. Any supporting information regarding the confirmation or acknowledgement of the purchase order should be attached to the purchase order using the attachment button in the header. Now we're ready to move on to the Lines tab and enter the items or services we want to order. Buyers can either select items that have already been set up in the item master, or they can enter information on goods and services that have not been set up. This facilitates those infrequent purchases of odds and ends that occasionally occur. We will enter both types so that you can see how this works. Our fictitious office station model builds pencils, so we'll order some erasers for production. Select the drop-down arrow in the item field on line 1 in the grid and select some erasers. We need 200,000 of these, and the unit cost is already populated based on the unit cost of the purchase order we copied from. We can change it if needed, and the new cost for this item is 2.5 cents each. The default due date in FOURA is set to 2 weeks from the order date. We can change the due date on each line if needed. This allows a buyer to schedule deliveries over multiple date ranges using one purchase order. Office Station has an account default of 1300 set up for its inventory items receiving inventory, so this is automatically populated on the line when the item is selected. To save the entered line, the buyer can either select the row header on the left margin or either of the two save buttons on the form. Now we'll enter a line for which we don't have or need an item set up for in FOURA. The first thing we'll do to add a new row is select the plus button in the grid. And sadly, our fictitious machine table was damaged and we need a new one. So in the description we'll enter pencil machine table surface and leave it as quantity 1 and enter a unit cost of $1,000. Because this item is not set up in FOURA, we'll need to manually enter the account by selecting the drop-down arrow in the account field. We'll select account 1720 manufacturing equipment and save the line. Now let's take a quick look at the Details tab. The Details tab provides us with a page view for each line on the purchase order. We can navigate each line by using the record selector at the bottom. On the Detail tab, we can enter who internally requested the item, who to deliver the item to, and an authorization control type and number if used. This purchase was authorized by the Operations Supervisor on purchase request number 2307. And now we'll attach the purchase request to the purchase order by selecting the attachment button and adding it to the archive. Now we'll enter line-specific notes on the Details tab that will print below the item description on the purchase order. And finally, we'll add a purchase order note regarding the conversation we just had with Mike at Stylus Manufacturing before finalizing this purchase order. Okay, the purchase order entry is finished, and now we're ready to release the purchase order. We can check the purchase order is valid prior to attempting to release it by selecting the Validate button. And the purchase order is valid. Now let's release the purchase order by selecting the Release button. The release process also validates the order and makes the purchase order available for receiving and for matching accounts payable invoices. And this purchase order now shows a status of released. Now we want to send the purchase order to the supplier. We can print the purchase order by selecting the Printer button and easily print out as many copies as we need and fax it or mail it to the supplier. Let's take a look at the purchase order first. It looks good and it's ready to be sent to the supplier. But we can also have FOURA email the purchase order to the supplier by selecting the Email At symbol button. We can also enter other email addresses if needed, and we can include a comment to send with the email if we wish. Now when we select the Send button, the recipients will receive a professional-looking email with a PDF version of the purchase order attached. Just a couple of other things to mention on the purchase order form. FOURA has a batch print option that can be used for printing a range of purchase orders. And we can limit the print effort by defining the purchase order range and limiting the scope further by using the controls that make the most sense in the batch print effort. Once the purchase order is released and sent, we can easily check up on the receipt status by selecting the View Receipt Details button on the header. Buyers can also make revisions to the purchase order after it's been released by selecting the Edit button in the header. And remember that FOURA will not allow revisions to occur if any downstream processes or events have taken place. If no such dependencies have occurred, the buyer can make a revision and re-release the purchase order by selecting the Release button again. And as you see, the purchase order has been re-released and the version number has changed. And now this purchase order can be resent to the supplier. If the buyer needs to cancel a purchase order, simply select the Cancel Delete Purchase Order button. Again, this can only occur if no downstream processes or events have taken place. And that's about it for creating, editing, and sending purchase orders. Before we go, it's worth mentioning here that FOURA has two very useful browse forms to facilitate information about purchase orders. These are the Browse PO form and the Browse PO Lines form. Both are located on the Purchasing functional menu. The Browse PO form provides a high-level information such as receipt and invoice status in a nice searchable grid view. Buyers can select the zoom link next to the purchase order number to zoom in and see additional details on any purchase order. The Browse PO Lines form focuses on the purchase order line detail. Like the Browse PO form, buyers can drill into the purchase order or supplier information by selecting any of the zoom links located on this form. Well, that wraps up this tutorial. Please be sure to check out additional tutorials to learn more about FOURA's powerful features, processes, and tips. Thanks for watching.